Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra daf Kuf Samach Gimel Bava Basra 163. Today's daf is dedicated for Shemir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shvuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael. In this Eis Tzara daf yomi, we're going to start on the bottom line of 162b. The Gemara has said that if a person leaves two lines over before from the contract before the witness is signed, that's going to be disqualified because perhaps Chas Hashem, a person can write in four fraudulent lines or forge the document in between the text of the contract and the signatures. So now the Gemara asks the question: these two lines that they said, what's the scope of these two lines on top of 163a? Hein vavirin, is it these two lines with their airspace? Odoma hein velo avirin, meaning to say, is it just the ink, or is it above the ink? You have to leave lines and space to write the long letters that go above the line and the short and below the line. Like, for example, the final chaf goes below the line and the lamed goes above the line. Boker Tov, Harold, good morning. So the question is, when it says, or on top of 163a, when it says you have to leave the two lines, is that the two lines is that the space? Is that two lines with the space above and below, or Dilma Hein V'Avirin, or maybe it's the two lines without the space above and below? The Gemara says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Mistabra the Hein V'Avirin. It's logical to assume that it's the lines with the space. It's logical to assume that it's the lines with the space. Why? Because if you're going to be in the position Hein V'Lo Avirin, if you're going to say it, or 163a at the top, if you're going to assume that it's the lines without the space, Shita Achas B'Lo Aviro and Chozia. What are you going to do with one line without the space? Obviously, you need the lines with the space, because in the Hebrew, when you write language, when you write the letters, you have to write above and below. That's how you write a letter. The letters go above and below the line. So if you just have one line without the space, obviously the forgery will be recognizable, because he's going to have to write it smaller than all the other letters on the contract in order to put space between one line and the next. And for sure, if he's going to write up bigger letters, then we'll recognize the forgery, that there's no space in between. So obviously the forgery will be recognizable. Means two lines with the space above the lines and below the lines, or with the space. But we'll have to see, what does the space mean? He first says another qualifying point about this. He says, Shnei Shitin Sha'amru, these two lines which they spoke about, B'ksav Yadei Edim, Moksav Yadei Sofer. These two lines that disqualify, that's if there's assuming the two lines, that has to be as though it was written by a witness and not by a professional scribe. Because the witnesses, we have to give them more space to write, because they can't write as small, and so therefore it's not professional. So it's a bigger handwriting. The professionals will write smaller. My time. What's the reasoning? Anybody who's going to forge a document, he's not going to go to the professional scribe to forge it. Presumably, he's more likely to just do it himself, and he's not a professional. So therefore, we assume that it's not a professional writing. Obviously, professionals also could be forgers, but we're talking about, not how we make a foolproof plan, but rather how we most discourage an honest person from stealing. Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Elazar, so the gamma, and when we say these two lines with the space above and below, what does that mean? How much space above, below? So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar says, "Kigon lech lecha lecha zal gabe zeh." So he says, like, let's say you have on one line you have the word lecha, and the other line below it you have the word lecha. So each of those words lecha has a lamed, which has the vav that goes above the line, And the final chaf, chaf pshuta, that goes below the line. And so therefore, we're going to need airspace above each line and below each line. So 2 lines and 4 airspaces. Alma kasavar shnei shitin v'arba avim. We need 2 lines and 4 airspaces. Whereas Rav Chia bar Avim Shmei De'ula Amar Kigon Lama Milamala V'chaf Milamata. He says, no, we just need 1 line above, 1 line below, and the line in between they could share. And as Rashbam says, the scribe can make sure that his lamed does not go into the chaf of the line above it, because that would make it look like a hey. Rashbam doesn't say that, but we know that from writing Sifrei Torah, Tefillin and Mezuzos, that would disqualify because it makes it look like a hey. And so therefore, that's what he's able to do. Alma kasavar shnei shitin u'shlosh avim. So we see he needs 2 lines with 3 airspaces above and below. Rabbi Avo Amar Kigon Baruch Ben Levi b'shita achas. He says no, it's just enough to disqualify if you have Baruch Ben Levi on 1 line, which has the 1 line with the airspace above and below, because shita achas shnei avim, 1 line with 2 airspaces, that would be enough to squeeze in 2 lines of text, and that would be enough for somebody to do a fraudulent document. So now the Gemara says, Amarav lo shanu. When do we say that if there's 2 lines between the text and the witnesses, it disqualifies? That's only if it's between Eidim L'chsav. That's only if it's between the witnesses and the text of the contract. Aval bein Eidim L'asharta. But if it's between the 2, if the 2 lines are between the witnesses and the asharta. Asharta is what's called a handpick, also in the Talmud. It's the certification that after the contract was written and signed by the witnesses, it would have to be certified either by the court saying we saw this signed in front of us, a bezdin of 3, or else 2 other witnesses could come forward at a later time and say, we recognize these signatories and we know that these signatures belong to them, and they are valid witnesses. So if the 2 lines the 2 blank lines would be between the witnesses and the certification, the handpick, which it's sounding like a notary, afilu tuva nami kosher. It could even be more than 2 lines will be kosher. Ma'ishna bein edem l'chsav. What's the reason between the witnesses and the text that we say it's not kosher? Don mazayif because of my debai, because we're worried he's going to add in something. The fraudulent person the forger is going to add in some text, v'chasime sahadi, and we have the signatures of the witnesses underneath. So if that's the case, ben edim lasharta nami, well, between the witnesses and handpick, we're also, why aren't we worried? Nami mezayef because of my debai. Why aren't we worried if you have a big blank space? He's going to forge it, write whatever he wants. V'chasime sahadi, and he's going to add in false witnesses, and then it'll be no problem. And it's already certified. It's like you're giving somebody a pre-notarized document. Say, go fill in whatever you want. Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case. When do we say if it's empty space? It works the mitayetle. It's not empty space. He drops ink down there to prevent the people from filling in. Like he draws a line with his pen, fills it in with ink. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, the scenario is that he's dropping ink there. Well, if that's the case, well, between the witnesses and the contract, why don't we also say that perhaps he's dropping in the ink, and yet we still say in that case it's no good. The Gemara says no. And this suggestion of dropping the ink between the witnesses and the contract wouldn't work. Why? And then we would disregard those witnesses because we say the witnesses are just signing that they saw that this document has blank ink there and as it's filled with ink there, and we should disregard that ink. Meaning to say, like they're initialing, like sometimes you cross something out on a document and people initial it. So they're just initialing that ink stained part of the document, but they're not signing to what's above the document. Well, the Gemara says, well, ben edim lasharta nami, amri bedina tiyutu dechasimi. Well, if that's the case, why don't we say the same thing with respect to between the witnesses and the certification? Why don't we say that that the court is just certifying that there is ink there, and they're not certifying the contract? The Gemara says no. Beidina atiuta lo chasimi. The court doesn't certify ink; they only certify contracts. They don't certify the ink. The Gemara says, but we have another concern. Because of my debate, sahadi. Well, now we have another problem. Why aren't we concerned? Okay, so we said it's okay to to have witnesses, a space, blank space filled with ink, and then certification. Well, why aren't we concerned that maybe he's going to cut off the top of the contract and to get rid of that piece of part of the parchment very easily? And then you have the space filled with ink, which is certified, but you just erase the ink, write whatever he wants, have the false witnesses sign it, and then it's a pre-certified document. So, and indeed, Rav says, shtaraba, if there's a contract that comes, hu ve'edav ala mechak, and the contract with the witnesses is on the erased part, it's kosher. So now you basically could just erase the ink, not that hard, and you'd be okay because it's certified already. Mara says, now we know that Rav is the one who says this. And Rav is also the one who said that you could have a big space between the witnesses and the certification. So therefore, Rav is going to have a problem. Now, Hanicho Rav Kahana, the Gemara says on top of 163b. Okay, this makes sense according to Rav Kahana, the Masling Mishmei de Shmuel. He didn't have this teaching in the name of Rav. He had this teaching that if the witnesses and the contract are on the part that was erased, he has it not in the name of Rav, he has it in the name of Shmuel. So he doesn't have to say it's a problem, because he could say that if the witnesses and the contract are on the erased part, it's no good. So Rav Kana wouldn't have a problem. But Rav Tuvyumi, the Rav, but according to Rav Tuvyumi, who taught this teaching in the name of Rav, that if the witnesses and the contract are on the part that was erased, it's still okay. Michael Maimer. And then how could Rav say you could have a certification way down at the bottom? Well, it's not going to work to just fill with ink, because then you could have fraud. So he answers, Kasavar Kolki Agavna. No, Rav Tavyumi would say that Rav's of the position that that in a case where you have the witnesses and the contract on a part that was erased, you can't certify it on the basis of the court, but you'd have to bring other witnesses that say, we know these witnesses who signed the document and we know that they're upstanding people and these are their signatures. So really, the Rashbam writes that this is a question basically really on any document that's certified, because you could always just cut away the top and just have the certification and then erase the text of the contract. So if it's an eraser, you can only use witnesses to certify it at that point. You can't rely upon the court. The Rabbi Yochanan says, so going back to the question, Rav had said that between the witnesses and the certification, you can have as much space as you want, because if they all erase it, then that certification basically won't work. You'll need witnesses to certify it. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo shanu el bein ha'edim l'chtav. He says, when do we say that 2 lines disqualifies it? Between the witnesses and the text of the contract. But if it's between the witnesses and the henpik and the certification, even one witness, even one line will be disqualified. Why is between the witnesses and the certification, we say even one line is no good? Because Dilma Guy is Eli. We're worried that you're going to cut off the whole top of the document because of Huva Edav B'Shita Achas. And then he'll have this document which is certified with one line free. And on that one line, he'll write the text of the, like, whatever he's giving, let's say a check. He'll write the one line, and he'll have the witnesses sign on that same line. Because other of Yochanan's of the position, Shtar Abba, who ve'ed of Veshita Achas Kasher. Rabbi Yochanan's of the position that if you have a one-line document with the witnesses signed on that same line as kosher, and therefore you can't even have one line between the certification. The certification has to be right next to the witnesses, otherwise it could lend itself to fraud. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, ben edim l'chsav, Nami, well, why are we going to allow one line between the witnesses and the text of the contract? Nami, Domagayas Leilai, aren't we concerned that he'll cut away the top of the text? Because of my debai, hadi. And he'll cut away the text, and he'll write what he wants, and we have the witnesses sign there. And then they're certified. The Gemara says, no, that won't work because Kasava, Rabbi Yochanan's on the position, Shtar Abba, Hu B'shita Achas, Ve'eda B'shita Acheres Pasol. No, he's on the position that if there are witnesses that come on one line and the contract is right above it, it's going to be disqualified because since anything that's written on the last line we said earlier is supposed to be a repetition, it's not enough. And so therefore, it's only when they're on the same line will it be kosher because the certification will be right beneath it. And the witnesses have to attest on that same line because otherwise you cut away what's on top of it. So therefore, the Gemara says, but why are we concerned that maybe why are we concerned that he's going to write it with his witnesses on one line? Well, that's the case. Why aren't we concerned that he'll write a new contract, he'll cut away the top, write a new contract on one line with the other witnesses who are certified below, and they'll certify it on the basis of those bottom witnesses, and then he'll get away with the text on the top. And why will he have four witnesses? He said, I want to publicize the matter with a lot of witnesses. The Gemara says, no, that won't work. It's because no, we're not gonna certify the document on the basis of the lower witnesses, but on the basis of the top witnesses. And those top witnesses will need to have, presumably, certification of other witnesses and not of the court that was signed below. So then the Gemara says, and I just want to make a larger point here, why are we learning about fraud here? Because the rabbis instituted that you needed to set it up, the whole document properly. They made takanas. And if not, it can lend itself to fraud, and they disqualified it because it was not done ketikun chachamim in the manner in which the rabbis taught. We see from here, the rabbi's responsibility is not only to make sure that the food is kosher and the eruv is kosher, and that there is yeshivas and schools and synagogues, but also to make sure that you create a business world that doesn't lend itself easily to fraud. Okay, so now we continue. So